So this system of contract law is maintained because it services essentially the capitalist and the sort of slave economy, as it were. And it's easier to do. It makes it simpler administratively. If you want to keep black people, if you want to put them in a different class when it comes to buying property, you do it before the transaction in some fashion. We redline, we say you can't buy here or whatever it is, but the transaction itself still maintains some type of like legal integrity, I guess. But how does using this system, and a lot of times, I think you're right that most of the times that black people went to court, it was in regards to a transaction with other black people for the most part. But how does exercising and sort of like invigorating this element of the law spread to the development of what we now call civil rights law and political rights, I guess?
That's a great question. So I think we have to go back to Abraham Lincoln's election. When he's campaigning for president, he articulates a vision of freedom that white Northerners are willing to sign on to in large enough numbers to make him president. And it goes like this, that there are three kinds of rights, three kinds of equality in America: political, social, and civil. Political rights mean the right to be elected to office, the right to vote, things like that, to serve on juries. Social rights are this grab bag of everything else, but it typically means the right to sit next to someone in a movie theater or to sit in a restaurant, or, and this is the most electric part of the campaign rhetoric, to marry someone. That's a social right. And so Lincoln says political rights are off the table for black people. Social rights are definitely off the table. And he gets big laugh lines from audiences in Illinois during the Stephen Douglas debates for US Senate. He gets big laugh lines when he cracks jokes about, well, I don't want to sleep with a black woman, and neither does anyone else in my party. And so those are off the table. But civil rights, that is, and this is how he puts it, the right to eat the bread which his own hand has earned by the sweat of his brow, the Negro is the equal of any white man in America. So Lincoln and the Republican Party come into the Freedom era with this vision of what you might call fundamental rights: property, contract, the right to sue and be sued. That's what goes in the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That's a winning formula, a winning ticket for Republicans throughout the late 19th century. And it quickly gets turned into something that we're still living with today, which is this libertarian idea of civil rights, which is that that's all you need in order to be free. African Americans and their white allies consistently say, even before Lincoln is campaigning on this message, that yes, you need these fundamental rights, these libertarian rights, but you also need political rights, and you need equality in the sphere of the so-called social. It is a badge of slavery, they say, to force black people to sit in a different section of a movie theater. It puts a mark on them that stigmatizes them and marks them as the descendants of slaves, humiliates them, subordinates them. And they say this consistently. And so that argument is something that activists begin in the 1830s and 40s, and they carry it through all the way through the civil rights marches of the 1960s. And the message is pretty simple. We need not just citizenship and equal rights in the realm of the civil, we need full citizenship. And until we have full citizenship, we are still, in some deep sense, enslaved.
And was it also the case that that those civil rights were, as they're exercised more, you begin to understand that they're also undermined if you don't have that sort of social and political, right? Because the political is ultimately determining what the nature of those civil rights are going to be. And if you're consistently dispossessed by them, whether it's, tax law that favors white wealthy people because they had the political power, or the fact that I can't eat in that restaurant, I can't travel to this town because I can't go to that hotel, that means I can't engage in the commerce that might be necessary if I'm a traveling salesman or something.
Absolutely. The connections are always there in some of the ways that you describe, and even more. So it is absolutely the case that activists argue that voting rights are essential to maintaining and protecting civil rights. And you can see that in the voting patterns that happen after Black people first get the right to vote in places like Mississippi. So the activists from SNCC, they go out, and their argument to people in Mississippi in 1964, 65, 66, their argument isn't vote for Lyndon Johnson to be president. Their argument is vote for the county tax assessor, vote these county supervisors out, because those are the guys who are maintaining this cabal of oligarchs at the county courthouse. These are the guys who determine whose land gets flooded, when the rains come. These are the guys who determine whose church is tax exempt, right? You need to go out and vote in order to throw out that old guard and elect a new guard who are going to redo the tax assessments. And so there's this fascinating story that happens there. And it goes to your point that these rights are interconnected. I'll give you another example. You've probably heard the case New York Times versus Sullivan, which is about press freedom. Mm-hmm. And there are at least 2 Supreme Court justices who want to overturn New York Times versus Sullivan. We'll see whether they can get others to sign on. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough in that case is that, it's a libel suit that Alabama officials file against a bunch of Black ministers and activists for an advertisement that they took out. And they win damages against these ministers, and they take the damages essentially by seizing the ministers' land and automobiles. So it's this incredible attack on Black people's civil rights, that is in the old-fashioned Abraham Lincoln sense, in order to attack this modern effort, this effort to achieve civil rights in the modern sense, that is anti-discrimination, equal and first-class citizenship in all realms of life.
And lastly, I guess, how does the civil rights of Lincoln's era, that being sort of like the transactional, operational rights of commerce and whatnot, ultimately become defined to include political and social rights by the time we get to, I don't know, the 1960s? Is it both a function of like a push from one direction and a pull from the other, or how does that change? How does that language change, and does it change under the law as well, or is that always been more of like a more vernacular question?
It's a long, slow process, and one of the interesting things is that, when you're looking at these cases in county courthouses, nobody ever really says civil rights. What they do is they go and they say, well, my neighbor's fence is, encroaching on my land, or that person's cow got into my land. They don't say I'm pursuing a civil rights case, even though that is essentially what they're doing. But what you see, especially beginning in the 1940s, is this increasing rhetorical turn toward equating civil rights with Negro rights. So there's this Life magazine cover in 1947 that my friend Chris Schmidt went back to and uncovered, where, it essentially says that civil rights means Negro rights. And as civil rights becomes more identified with Blackness and Black equality, it becomes more identified with this anti-discrimination, anti-subordination principle. Now, that had always been there since the 1866 Civil Rights Act, because you remember it said, shall enjoy the same rights as are enjoyed by white citizens. So it's always been there all along. But by the 1940s, that same logic is being used to revive this older logic of anti-discrimination in property and contract, and to extend it into the world of the social and the political. And in a sense, that's kind of what the civil rights struggle is all about in the 1950s and 60s. But what's fascinating is that Black people keep exercising those old-fashioned civil rights. And of course, we still are today, right? We own houses, we're making contracts, we're running businesses and churches, all of which are dealing with contract and property 24/7. But the rhetoric of civil rights increasingly implies that those activities, that those ideas about property and contract, it implies that those are not civil rights, that there's something else. They're in a different category. You can even see it in law schools. You know, law schools teach this important curriculum in the first year, and it consists of a bunch of courses, and the headliners are property, contract, and tort, and civil procedure, and criminal procedure. Those are the courses that students learn in their first year. And then, if you want, in the third year, you can take an elective called civil rights. So there's this implication that the two are distinct. The 19th century sense that civil rights are property and contract, I think, has been lost even in law schools.
It's fascinating. Dylan Penningroth, professor of law and history at the University of California, Berkeley. The book is Before the Movement, The Hidden History of Black Civil Rights. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and in the podcast and YouTube description. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.